Earlier this week, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump took the stage in their first debate. As many of you probably watched, they presented contrasting visions for our country, underscoring the deep political divide between their parties and the supporters. Our speaker today contends that while divisiveness in Washington has been around for decades, it really took root during Hillary's husband's administration. I'm thrilled to welcome Patrick Maney to share his views on Bill Clinton and his administration, and to discuss his book, Bill Clinton, the New Gilded Age President. The book provides an in-depth perspective of our 42nd president and the transformative era which he presided. Professor Maney teaches at Boston College, Modern American History, with an emphasis on politics and the presidency. He has written biographies about FDR and the New Deal Senator Robert La Follette Jr. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Maney.
Shortly after I began this project, I was invited to give a talk to the noon meeting of the Rotary Club in Camden, South Carolina. I was teaching at the University of South Carolina at the time. And my topic was on Franklin Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor. But when my host introduced me, she mentioned that I was writing a book on the Clinton presidency, at which people started to boo. And I got up and said, how can you boo? I haven't even started this book. How can you boo me? But it was an example of how strongly people felt about the Clintons. Nobody who was of age during the 1990s is neutral. All of them have an opinion, like my friends at the Rotary Club in Camden. A footnote, a couple of years later, I was back in South Carolina and ran into one of the booers. By this time, Barack Obama was in the White House, and this guy said to me, he said, I sort of miss Bill Clinton. I wish he were still president. And I sort of shook my head in disbelief. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it's an example of the roller coaster that the Clintons have been on since the beginning of their careers. When I was first approached about writing a book on the Clintons, I was eager to do so because so much of what happened during the 1990s still shapes our lives today. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine it, but it's true. That's the decade during which the internet, personal computer, 24-hour news cycle came into being in a big way. And in politics, sort of the hyper-partisanship that still has a stranglehold on our political system today. All are deeply rooted in the Clinton 90s, as are current trade, welfare, and deregulatory policies. So in a year which may turn out to be a referendum on the Clinton presidency, I think it's time to revisit that decade. I was also wanted to write and study the Clintons because I wanted to understand why they were and are such polarizing figures. The most polarizing first couple since Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And it seemed to me at the time that reactions to the Clintons, both pro but especially con, were out of proportion to anything that they did or said. For example, during the 1990s, Republicans and conservatives, depicted both the Clintons as kind of radical retreads from the 1960s. And unquestionably, they did rub some people the wrong way by supporting abortion rights and affirmative action and gays in the military, gender equality. But most of their views were squarely in the mainstream of American politics, and even in some respects, I think, to the right of the mainstream. Bill Clinton's economic and fiscal policies, in fact, I think made him one of the most conservative Democrats fiscally in the 20th century, one of the most conservative Democratic presidents in the 20th century. Here, after all, was a president who hailed the end of big government, who was arguably more pro-business than pro-labor, whose administration approved more corporate mergers than his two Republican predecessors combined, who approved big cuts in welfare, who is tough on crime, wore his religion on his sleeve. So, it just, when you look at that record, it just doesn't add up to being, to the depiction that critics had of him. Yeah, there were progressive offsets, like the earned income tax credit, and that is probably the most effective anti-poverty measure in modern American history. There was the Brady gun control bill and a host of progressive executive actions, but none of them added up to this kind of depiction of the Clintons as radicals. In foreign policy, before Clinton became president, he supported the first Gulf War. Not all Democrats did. And then as president, he was often more willing to deploy American forces abroad than a lot of his conservative critics. His record, I don't think, and views don't explain this reaction to the Clintons, nor do they explain the haters, the reasons that the Clintons, evoked so much hatred. How, for example, to account for the reaction that greeted Hillary Clinton when she went to Seattle in the fall of 1994 to promote health care reform. The Secret Service had never seen anything like it. The crowds that greeted her were so menacing that they insisted that she put on a bulletproof vest. Look, they had seen angry crowds before, but never for a first lady. And then as she was leaving the speaking venue, a crowd menacingly gathered around her car. The Secret Service confiscated a gun and 2 knives and made several arrests. Hillary Clinton may have been onto something when she said only partly in jest that she must remind some people of their boss or their mother-in-law. What she was suggesting was that both she and her husband were kind of like a national, Rorschach or inkblot test upon which people projected their hopes and fears, their values and attitudes. When I was teaching at Tulane, where I taught for a long time in the 1990s, when Hillary was First Lady, I was teaching a course on the Great Depression, and I had students read an article about Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton. And during class discussion, one of the male students just simply couldn't contain himself. He burst out and said, "I hate Hillary Clinton. She's just like my stepmother." And I I was shocked. But as I looked around the room, I could see some people nodding, saying, oh yeah, I understand that. For many young women, however, including many women in my class, Hillary Clinton was a role model, somebody who was not just an appendage to her husband's career, but somebody who had a significant and productive career of her own. Critics were not alone, I don't think, in projecting onto the Clintons. I mean, ardent supporters were as well. How else to account for the reactions of some, like writer Toni Morrison, who described Bill Clinton as the first black president and one of us, even while deploring his support for welfare reform, for racially discriminatory criminal sentencing guidelines, and his support for the death penalty. So it seems to me to sort of study the Clintons as a little bit like holding up a mirror. It tells us as much about ourselves as it does about them. December 1996, just a month or so after Clinton was reelected to a second term, the New York Times published a poll of prominent historians and political scientists rating the presidents from great to failure. Scholars have been playing this ratings game pretty much sort of on an annual basis since 1948. In that poll, scholars rated Clinton in the average category, along with Gilded Age presidents like Benjamin Harrison and Chester A. Arthur. And Clinton, look, he understood that greatness was reserved for Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, who had faced great challenges to the nation's survival, and to George Washington, whose every action set a precedent for his successors. But he was so disappointed, he was wondering, well, what about the near great category? Or at least above average. A short time later, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian and biographer, and a participant in that poll, found herself seated next to Clinton at a White House dinner. And Clinton was going on and on about this poll to her, and she tried to make light of it. She's a big Boston Red Sox fan, and so she said, look, if you will intervene to help forestall a baseball players' strike that was threatening actually to wipe out the 1997 season, she said, if you're successful, I'll go ahead and change my vote. He didn't find that funny at all. He was just inconsolable about his low rating. I think actually that the rating was appropriate in a way. That Clinton did share some similarities to presidents that served during the Gilded Age. It was also appropriate, I think, that he found himself in the company of Gilded Age presidents, because it was while he was running for office that America sort of rediscovered the late 19th century. I mean, that period so memorably described as the Gilded Age by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. What they had in mind was sort of like something glittery on the outside, but once you kind of scraped beneath the surface, you found something cheap and tawdry. It may also have been a reference to Shakespeare gilding the lily putting excess on something that's already beautiful and sort of destroying what's beautiful in the process. Before the 1990s, the Gilded Age was, largely of interest to nostalgia buffs and devotees of Mark Twain and O. Henry and other writers. As something you might read about or learn about in a history class and then quickly forget. About all people remembered of the Gilded Age were those fabulous mansions like the Vanderbilts, the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, or Biltmore Estates in Asheville, North Carolina. But then during Clinton's ascent to the presidency, interest in the Gilded Age took a more serious turn as commentators began to note parallels between that late 19th century time and the late 20th century time. Parallels that included growing income inequalities, racial and ethnic tensions, sort of conspicuous consumption, gaudy lifestyles, and in politics, partisan warfare really out of proportion to the differences between the parties. If the late 19th century had, Millionaires Row on Fifth Avenue in New York City and the Breakers and Biltmore Estates, the 1990s had Trump Tower and McMansions inside gated communities. It was sort of enough to constitute a new Gilded Age. The parallels between these two periods were not lost on Bill Clinton. It was the original Gilded Age and the 2 decades that followed, the Progressive Era, that he came back to time and time again. This was his historical touchstone. This was the period he believed that was most like his own. And the most important defining characteristic of both eras, he thought, was change. Change, transformative change that was so vast that it only happened a couple of times in American history. But when it did happen, it changed the way people lived and the way people worked. Clinton believed that there was no holding back change. We were in a transformative era. In the late 19th century, the United States had morphed from a predominantly agrarian nation into an urban industrial giant. In his time, he said that the United States was going from an industrial age to an information technology age, and in world affairs, from the Cold War to a global society. He saw, and said so repeatedly, he saw his task, his mission to help guide the country through this transition. And what he hoped was that the transition would go more smoothly, more rapidly than it had, and with less hardship and pain than it had in the late 19th century. So that's really, how he presided over this transformative era. That's kind of the plot line for my study. 50 years from now, my hunch is that historians looking back will look upon Clinton, as well as the president, as well as his immediate predecessors and his successors, save from Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter up through Clinton, up to maybe Obama and his successor. I mean, it's too early to tell about that. But historians will look upon those presidents more or less as individuals than as a group that shared certain common characteristics. Now look, historians now take the presidents of the original Gilded Age much more seriously than they once did. No longer do they see the presidents, say, from Rutherford B. Hayes through William McKinley as kind of, interchangeable non-entities. Some, we now know, some were abler and had more influence than others, and yet of those original Gilded Age presidents, none had the impact, say, of a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson or an Andrew Jackson or an Abraham Lincoln. Similarly, with the presidents of Clinton's cohorts, I mean, some had greater influence, were abler than others, but none of that group, again, from Ford or Carter up through, maybe up through the present, none had the influence of a Roosevelt, Theodore or Franklin, or Harry Truman, or a Lyndon Johnson. It wasn't, it's not their fault. It was just that in this sort of new Gilded Age, economic forces, as in the original Gilded Age, economic forces were in the driver's seat, and presidents and politicians were along for the ride. Let me put this another way. I asked one of Clinton's top economic advisors this question. I said, I know you can't quantify this, but exactly, how much influence does a president or an administration have on the economy? This advisor, still very much a fan of the Clintons and very praiseworthy about Clinton's economic stewardship, said this, that if the elder Bush had been reelected in 1992, the economy probably would have been about the same as it was under Clinton. And for two reasons. First, there were some really striking similarities in economic approach between Clinton and the elder Bush. Both favored freer trade, deregulation of important sectors of the economy, and welfare reform. But more importantly, and this is really the point, it was not the White House that was driving the economy during the 1990s, but it was the internet, the computer, and telecommunications industries. That's where the action was. Now, don't get me wrong here. Clinton, I think, made a lot, maybe not the most, but he made much of, I think, kind of the limiting opportunities he had on the domestic front. I think anybody even vaguely familiar with the history of healthcare reform could have predicted the long odds against Hillary care. But who would have predicted, and I don't think I could have, Clinton's success in kind of refashioning the Democratic Party along more kind of centrist lines of neutralizing hot-button issues like welfare, for good or for ill, welfare and crime, with which Republicans had been bludgeoning Democrats for decades. So there was a lot, and then even with a creative use of executive actions, which has set a precedent, I think, for what President Obama has been doing. Clinton achieved a lot that he could not have gotten, a lot of measures that he could not have gotten through Congress. Clinton also, opened up the presidency to American culture in a way that it hadn't been before. The first baby boomer in the White House, no matter who it was bound to have some influence on the image of the presidency. But, it's hard to imagine other baby boomers having the same kind of impact that Clinton did. I mean, can you imagine, Al Gore or Newt Gingrich or George W. Bush doing a saxophone rendition of Heartbreak Hotel on Arsenio Hall, or doing a Elvis impression on Imus in the Morning, or revealing his underwear preferences on MTV, or inspiring a best-selling novel, Primary Colors, a popular film of the same name, and then this fabulously successful The West Wing, which is sort of modeled on the Clinton presidency. Still, you know, it's one thing to kind of change the image, refurbish the image of the presidency, and another to guide the destiny of a great nation. I think Clinton did one, but not the other. Surprises, things that surprised me during research for this. Maybe the biggest surprise was foreign policy. You know, I thought I was paying attention to what was going on during the 1990s, but I guess like everybody else, I got preoccupied with, you know, impeachment and all the domestic controversies. But foreign policy really loomed much larger than I had imagined. And I think Clinton had a freer hand in foreign policy than he did in domestic policy. After a stumbling start, his administration devised what I think was at least a plausible replacement for the containment doctrine that had guided U.S. foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Clinton helped diffuse crises in Bosnia and Kosovo, of course, but also in Haiti, North Korea, and I think, you know, sort of most importantly, although people don't know about it or remember much about it, he helped resolve a nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan, which might have been, you know, one of the worst catastrophes, had one of the most tense moments it was since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, more controversially, Clinton expanded the president's war-making power over Congress. And he also, I think, anticipated some of the controversial practices of his successor, George W. Bush. For example, we tend to associate this controversial practice with the Bush administration, whereby American agents can capture on foreign soil suspected terrorists, extraordinary rendition this is called, and instead of bringing them back to the United States for trial, they can drop them off, what happened in the 90s and during the Bush administration, drop them off in Syria and in Egypt for interrogation and incarceration. Now, the Bush administration greatly expanded the practice, but it really got started during the Clinton administration. You know, the other thing is, and this is much more complicated than it's going to sound, and one of the things that disturbs me about this campaign is how the intervention in Iraq has been sort of simplified way beyond anything that resembles the historical record. But the Clinton administration, I think, did help pave the way for the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq in 2003 by accusing Saddam Hussein of harboring weapons of mass destruction. President Clinton, his Secretary of Defense William Cohen, and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright repeatedly claimed that Saddam Hussein was in possession of nuclear material, anthrax, nerve gas, and other weapons of mass destruction. Here's something I had forgotten. In 1998, Congress passed, almost unanimously in both houses, Congress passed and Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act. You know, do you know about them? The Iraq Liberation Act called for the ouster of Saddam Hussein and actually appropriated about $100 million for the president to use at his discretion to arm and train opponents of Saddam Hussein. Now look, you know, a lot happened between 1998 and 2003. A lot of history was to unfold. I'm not saying there is a direct line, but I am saying there's a connection. And I should also say, I mean, you know, again, what sort of bothersome, the Clinton administration, from looking at briefing papers and others, when they claimed that Hussein had, you know, weapons of mass destruction, they didn't have ulterior motives. This was, for them, the kind of the best intelligence that they had at the time. They were sincere in this. I'm also saying that when we think of Bill Clinton's administration, we don't often think about, you know, what we think about. Right? We don't often think about foreign policy. I'm saying that we should think about foreign policy. Hillary. To my mind, you know, sort of Eleanor Roosevelt, Hillary's role model, is still the gold standard among first ladies. And other first ladies, and I hate that phrase, but they were sort of stuck with it until maybe this next election. Other first ladies have had influence, you know, Edith Wilson and Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter and Nancy Reagan, of course. But none, almost all of them, played a behind-the-scenes role. Whereas Hillary played an unprecedented, upfront policy-shaping role as co-chair, along with Ira Magaziner, of the President's Task Force on Healthcare Reform. Now look, there was a lot of stuff wrong with Hillary Care. Nothing more wrong, I think, than locating the reform effort in the White House rather than in Congress, which reflected a fundamental misreading, by the way, of history. But having said that, I came away, I guess, you know, impressed with Hillary's mastery of detail. I mean, you hear about this all the time, and you see evidence of it, but until you look at these briefing papers and see transcripts of her talks, you don't realize how expert she was, how not only did she master the detail, but she had an uncommon gift for explaining it to others. But what impressed me, and this was for me the big surprise, was how assiduously she courted Congress, including members of both parties. That Hillary Care didn't turn out to be bipartisan was not her doing. It was the result of Republicans, including a group of moderate Republicans who were talking to her and favored health care for a while. Republicans deciding ultimately that it was not in their political interest to get into bed with the Clintons. Even after they started to pull away, Hillary went after them. You know, she wouldn't let up on them. She still had this hope that she could persuade them to join in a bipartisan health care program. So my reading of the briefing papers and all the rest suggests that, first of all, Hillary would be much more engaged and I think more successful with Congress than President Obama has been, or certainly than Donald Trump would likely to be. A third sort of surprise to me, although maybe it shouldn't be such a surprise, was that the public and media attention during the 90s was, I think, in inverse proportion to the importance of the issues involved. I mean, Clinton's, personal life, impeachment, all the rest dominated the news, but very little attention was given to some of the things that, again, do shape our lives today. The deregulation after 60 years of the telecommunications industry, and the repeal of the Glass-Steagall banking bill, this New Deal era measure, which had separated banks into investment and commercial entities. Today, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders bring crowds to their feet when they condemn the repeal of Glass-Steagall. 2 weeks after the passage of that repeal bill, a Gallup poll disclosed that 2/3 of the public could not identify what the original Glass-Steagall bill was, much less that it had been repealed. And the point is that the coverage of that issue, seemingly so important to us today, a measure that some think contributed, though I don't, think contributed to the Great Recession of 2008. Coverage of that issue was pretty much confined to the business pages and to trade publications. 2 reasons these important issues didn't get a whole lot of attention. One, they were enormously complex and technical in nature. And sort of describing complex economic and fiscal measures is not the forte of the media, and never has been, in a way that you don't need a PhD in economics to understand. But the second reason is even more important, I think. The reason that repeal of Glass-Steagall didn't get a lot of attention, that the deregulation of telecommunications industry didn't get a lot of attention, or that another deregulatory measure, a measure that prohibited federal regulation of credit default swaps and other financial products known as derivatives, that didn't get a whole lot of attention, was simply there wasn't a whole lot of controversy about this. Liberals as well as conservatives supported these deregulatory measures. Not all, but the vast majority of them did. There was a faith during the 90s in this, kind of free market approach, similar to that, to the spirit that existed in the late 19th century. And I think that's an additional reason for that. I call this a new Gilded Age. Finally, Bill Clinton's legacy. How will he be remembered? I think a lot has to do with the outcome of this election. But I also think, as I mentioned before, I think he is sort of destined to be remembered not so much as an individual, but as a member of a group. Again, these presidents from Ford or Carter up through, who knows, Obama and his successor. And to the extent, though, that he is remembered as an individual, I think it will be for a personal quality. And that is his remarkable resiliency, personal resiliency. This guy has been down and almost out sort of more times than you can count. In 1980, he was defeated for re-election as governor of Arkansas, and it looked like the end of a very promising career. 1988, he gave a disastrous nominating speech for Michael Dukakis at the Democratic National Convention. Everybody thought we were ready to write him off. 1992, when he was running for the presidency and was beset by one scandal after another. And you think that Trump has survived a whole lot of things. You think, how could he get over this? Well, I would put Clinton in 1992, a very close second to this. I mean, he looked like there was no way he could recover. 1994, the Republicans captured both houses of Congress for the first time in over 40 years, and it looked like Clinton was destined to be a one-term president. He goes on to win re-election, survive impeachment, and then end his administration with the highest job approval rating of any modern president. And since he left the White House, he's had several, near-death experiences. One sort of most notable in 2008, where I don't think he didn't doom Hillary's campaign, but he sure did not help Hillary's primary campaign against Barack Obama. But, the 9 lives, I mean, he's long since used up his 9 lives. Anna Quindlen, Anna Quindlen, the journalist and writer, once compared Clinton to a child's inflatable toy, something, weighted down at the bottom. And she said, you punch it, and it just bounces right back. That, I think, will be Bill Clinton's legacy. And who knows, it might well be Hillary Clinton's legacy as well. So let me thank you for your attention, and especially in view of what I experienced in Camden, South Carolina, I thank you for your sort of forbearance. No booing. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions or, yes?
So if Hillary gets elected, do you see Bill trying to play an active role in sort of shaping public policy to go into his legacy in that way?
Oh, yeah, if Hillary is elected, I can't imagine that he wouldn't play a major role, and he should, play a major role, because presidents need all the help they can get. So I don't know exactly what role he would play, sort of maybe as an envoy or something. For a while, I was thinking that a perfect place for him. Well, he one time once told Madeleine Albright, who before becoming Secretary of State was ambassador to the United Nations, he once told her that second only to the presidency, the job he most coveted was as ambassador to the United Nations. So, that might be a possibility, although I think that is now a cabinet office, and I think there's a nepotism prohibition on that. But yeah, he would play a big role. I recently have read, and I'm reviewing that big book on George W. Bush, this big biography of George W. Bush. And one thing that struck me was George H.W. Bush. One thing that struck me was that the father was reticent he had good instincts, but he was reticent about advising his son. And I think if he had advised his son, and his son had taken the advice, it might have turned out better. So I think, again, a president needs help, and I think Bill Clinton would be very enormously helpful to Hillary Clinton. Yes. It was based on research. I've seen him a number of times in person, and my wife said, "Well, you've got to talk to him. You've got to talk to him." And my wife's sister used to run the only remaining independent bookstore in San Jose, and one time he came into her bookstore, and she talked about how just for that moment, it's like just the two of them. Bookstore was crowded with people. So yeah, I would like to have met Clinton, I guess, in a way, but I don't think it would change my storyline. I mean, I did a lot of research and primary resources available, from the Clinton Library, and also interviews. So if the opportunity presented itself, that would be great. I'm not sure. I think this is a pretty sort of objective look at the Clinton president. I'm not sure right now he'd be real keen on talking to me when I talk about, new Gilded Age presidents and putting him in the company of some of those late 19th century presidents, but maybe would. Yes?
So I was interested to hear you say that the controversies that he survived in his initial election campaign just came a close second to Donald Trump's this time around. Could you give a couple examples of those?
Yeah, and you'll be hearing, of course, if Trump is true to his word, you'll be hearing in the next debate about these. But Clinton was he had come from nowhere, but everybody in the aftermath of that first Gulf War, the Democrats thought that, George H.W. Bush was going to win this. So a lot, like Mario Cuomo dropped out and others. So Clinton had a pretty significant lead for the nomination. And then Jennifer Flowers, this lounge singer from Little Rock, Arkansas, made this claim that they had this like 12-year affair, which he denied, and then Jennifer Flowers presents tapes of their telephone conversations, and that looked like that was it. That sort of died down a little bit when it came out, these information about how Clinton had evaded the draft during Vietnam. And none of these documents had been public, and that came out, I think, during the New York primary, and I thought, Jennifer draft, no, he's done. And then, there are a whole bunch of other things, but he was asked one time about had he ever smoked marijuana, and you know his quote. He said he tried it but didn't inhale, and I mean that made him look pretty silly. So yeah, I think those, and the infidelities, the draft, which at that time was pretty important, still pretty important. Those things were, in fact, they seem like kind of more serious than the stuff that has come up in this. But he survived and went on to get the nomination, and of course to win the election. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I always liked Bill Clinton, and actually met him a few times in the course of the Northern Irish peace process, where he was a major figure.
Right.
Based there.
And that's another in foreign policy.
Absolutely. And he really did a great job of helping Northern Ireland. But what always bothered me about Clinton is first that he went back to oversee the execution of a mentally ill person during the election campaign initially, and then even more importantly, the Rwanda disaster, where the American government and Clinton personally sat by while 100,000 were slaughtered. How can we reconcile that with that very positive picture which I think many of us?
Yeah. Well, certainly the death penalty is hard to square, and that's when I talk about why I think the ardent supporters were also reading something that they wanted to read into Clinton, because the death penalty is discriminatory, racially discriminatory in its application, and yet that did not prevent him from getting support of African Americans. I will say that Rwanda, Clinton later owned up to it. He said this was the most serious mistake or tragedy of his administration. So at least he admitted it. Now, looking at the documents and the record and briefing papers, what struck me was that how complicated that was. It now is pretty clear. It was genocide going on, but nobody knew who was who in a way. And the United States did not have a presence on the ground there, nor was there much support. And when Clinton intervened in Haiti, the American Black Caucus was very fierce in urging him to do something in Haiti. Rwanda, nothing. So I think when you look at it, yeah, it's a black mark on his administration. But when you look at it in context, it's not to excuse it, but you think, yeah, you can sort of tragedies happen, and that was certainly one of them.
How
would you categorize the Oslo Accords?
Well, I think, I don't know all the details of them, but I think that Clinton, I think he did the best possible. I think he came up with the best solutions that were possible at the time. And I don't know what the sort of the current state of things is, but I think it was it was not perfect, but it was an improvement over, one of the worst kind of tragedies that was occurring, instances of genocide since the Second World War. So I give him, Holbrooke, I think deserve a lot of credit for those. I mean, would you disagree with that, or?
Again, no follow-through to see that they were carried out.
Yeah. Well, yes.
I've often heard that Clinton was a very good one-on-one political speaker. What sort of characteristics made him this way, and I guess maybe helped him out in the election?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this over and over again. Let me tell you a story. I can't remember her name, a prominent author that I interviewed, and she was telling me that she lived in Washington, D.C., and after the Monica Lewinsky thing, she and her women, and they knew the Clintons, they were furious at Bill Clinton, what he had done and what he had done to Hillary. And so anyway, there was a book signing at somebody's house, and the women got together, all of whom knew the Clintons. They got together and said, when Bill comes, we're not going to talk to the guy. We're going to give him a cold shoulder. And this author had I think like a 8-year-old daughter. This was in the late afternoon. Picked the daughter up from school, took her to this book signing at somebody's house. And nobody was paying any attention to this 8-year-old. I mean, they're all talking among themselves. She just is standing there awkwardly. Clinton comes in, walks in. Both Clintons come in. Bill Clinton goes right over, he goes right over to that 8-year-old girl, kneels down on his knee, and starts talking to her. And this author, when she was telling me the story, she said, you can't not like the guy. So I think that's an example. And then again, the most kind of consistent thing I've heard, like my wife's sister was talking about how he comes into this Willow Glen bookstore and it's jam-packed with reporters and Secret Service and everything. And for 30 minutes, it's like the two of them, so he does have this rare gift. And I think it has to be, it's not a put on. I think it has to be something genuine. He's interested in other people and other people's stories. And, Hillary Clinton, for all her, very significant gifts, she does not have that kind of she does not sort of relate to people in that way. That's one way in which they've been a good team, because they are complementary. Yeah. But when I've heard him quite often. I've heard him talk publicly, and I've never been, I've never been that impressed. I wasn't unimpressed anyway, but it just wasn't as moving. I mentioned Mario Cuomo one time. The two best speeches I've ever heard in my life were both by Mario Cuomo in person. The father of the governor of New York now. But Clinton never, and then you look at his inaugural addresses, his big speeches, State of the Unions, very few have sort of memorable lines. They're not going to go down in history. They're not going to be remembered. But it's that, again, that the individual rather than maybe the president will have the longest and most enduring legacy. Yes?
What's the negative visceral reaction against Hillary Clinton?
God, I was hoping that I would be able to understand this better, and I come away not understanding it really. And I think partly it's just her personality, it's a defense. She contributes to it in some ways with a defensiveness and a combativeness. But there is just something about Hillary Clinton that people just don't, they don't warm to. I mean, do you know that old nursery rhyme? I don't know if I can remember it. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. The reason why, I cannot tell. But this I know, and know full well, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. I think there's something about that. I mean, to me, it is non-rational or irrational. I'm somebody who's read all the. There's nobody who has been, I don't think, investigated as much as both Clintons. And so I don't know. I don't get it. I don't get it. So I'm telling you, that was one of the reasons I did this book. But I can describe the phenomenon, but I can't. It's something that has to do with the '60s, I think. There's no question. I mean, again, and I think this projection. People aren't looking at Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton. They're bringing something to it during the '90s, and look, they're still doing it today. Yeah.
One, just a follow-up there, and I've been thinking about this myself, Jesse. If it were a man, Hillary, everything else, the way Hillary is, the rest, however you want to characterize it, if it were a man instead of a woman, would the reaction be the same?
No. No, I don't have any doubt that has a lot to do with it, too. Yeah, no question about that. Yes.
You talked about sort of Bill Clinton's kind of moderating, I think you talked about sort of a moderating influence within the Democratic Party, and I wanted to ask if you think he has sort of any ideological legacy, especially as it relates to the party itself, or is he just sort of seen as practices?
Well, so the paradox is that in the '90s, he and Hillary had this image of being radicals from retreads from the 1960s. And now his and Hillary's big problem is being seen as too conservative. I was giving a talk someplace else, and somebody said was really deploring his actions in making the Democratic Party sort of a more centrist organization, and saying, why don't, Bill Clinton should have stood up for these values and not sort of kowtowed to this conservative breeze that was sweeping through the country. What I said was, I sort of agree with you, but the person you and I might have preferred to run for the presidency in 1992 would never have been elected. So I think he did. I think he believes this. I think he comes out of an environment that I don't think this was just a put on. I think he has very kind of moderate instincts. But I also think, this is, again, what in this new Gilded age, his view that we were living in a transformative era here. I think he diagnosed this era better than any other modern president has. I just think, like the programs he supported, trade, liberalization of trade, especially. I think there's a lot. One thing that's disturbing about this campaign is how it's sort of being distorted. I think that is in the long-term interests of the United States. And one of the great stories, I think, in modern history is that world poverty. You know this. The World Bank has pointed this out. We have had over the last couple of years the biggest decline in poverty worldwide in human history. Well, I think in maybe 50 years I might be wrong about. Maybe people are going to look back to NAFTA and some of those others and say, that contributed. Maybe there were winners and losers in Detroit and Cleveland and elsewhere, but that actually had a positive global effect. So I'm going on. I'm not answering your question. But. Yes?
That enabled Fox News to become.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I'm not sure exactly the details, but he did sign the Telecommunications Act of 1996 or so, and this was the first major deregulation or re-regulation of the telecommunications industry since, I think, 1935, and it was, you know, when there was no internet and, you know, cell phones and so on. But he got a lot out of that bill. I mean, it was a compromise provision. But if you're talking about sort of the equal time provision, is that? I mean, that actually goes back to the 1980s. That was not undone by the telecommunications reform. But you're talking about the gutting of that equal time provision. That was in the 1980s. I think the same economic advisor, by the way, that I cited before, now thinks that the telecommunications bill was really a major mistake. I mean, one thing, it was way oversold, and I mean, I don't know about anybody here, but are you paying less for cable than you were before this? I mean, that was part of the promise. But I don't think that, you know, I don't think you can blame Bill Clinton for Fox News. Maybe. Yes.
In many respects, this election has become sort of a referendum on Bill Clinton's presidency as welfare, criminal justice regulation are kind of rehashed. But as you mentioned, when he left office in the 90s, he enjoyed a 60%. Since this campaign to about 50, so what do you think has precipitated? Are people just
Yeah, it's part, again, of this roller coaster. I mean, he left on a high note, but within a year or so, because of the controversial pardons that he issued, Rich and others, as he was leaving the White House, other controversies, his popularity plummeted. And then it came up again. And in 2012, I mean, he made a better case at the convention, Democratic convention, for Barack Obama than Obama made for himself. You know, it's hard. I think the times are changing so rapidly that, you know, again, with the Clintons Bill Clinton was a believer in this. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was a prominent historian who had argued that American politics moved in cycles. I mean, you would have kind of conservative and liberal cycles. And I think what happened during the 1990s, it was, you know, the pendulum was stuck on conservative, and Clinton adapted to that pretty well. But I think with Bernie Sanders, and also to an extent with Trump, we are seeing that pendulum swinging pretty rapidly in a more liberal or activist direction. And so I think one thing that you know, the Clintons were proudest of during the 90s now are liabilities, like the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which I don't, by the way, don't think that had much, if anything, to do with the recession. But that's what I'm saying. I mean, he and it's sort of especially Hillary have been so rapidly overtaken by events, and she is just not quite as nimble at sort of, you know, adapting to this new political environment as he was. But they'll, you know, again, he's sort of, a year from now, he's going to, I'll tell you, he's going to come back again, yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk about the way Clinton and Gingrich, what explains of course,
Yeah, Newt Gingrich, I mean, I don't want to sound sort of overly partisan here, but I think in terms of kind of the hyper-partisanship toxicity of the political process, I think you can date it. I mean, there are lots of things that happen, but Newt Gingrich's ascendance in the House of Representatives, I think, had a lot to do with it. This was a kind of, you know, destroy everything in their path. But yet, these two guys, both baby boomers, did have this kind of, I don't know, what kind of a symbiotic relationship. I mean, they fed off one another. And Gingrich himself would say, and I quoted him saying that he was fearful of being in Clinton's presence for too long because he thought he's going to win me over. So they were, and this isn't right to your point, but one thing that is striking to me is Clinton. One time Alan Simpson, who was a conservative Republican senator from Wyoming, one time Clinton asked him, he said, do you Republicans really believe all this stuff you're saying about the Democrats? And Simpson sort of laughed. He said, oh, no, of course not. We're just doing this to get even with what you Democrats did in the 1980s with Bork and others. So, but with Clinton, Bill Clinton, he likes the game of politics. And I think Newt Gingrich likes the game of politics. And so they don't get mad at one another. They do what's sort of necessary, but ultimately, Clinton really disliked the media. As he had a Nixonian dislike of the media. But he thought politics was politics. That's just what you do in politics. So they did have this relationship. And there are very few politicians, elected officials, that Clinton didn't really get along with. He liked them because, again, he thought he understood where they were coming from, that they all had to kind of stand for election and they had to do certain things and make certain compromises. But that was a very interesting kind of relationship. Now, again, the comparison with Hillary, even despite what I said about health care, Bill doesn't take political attacks personally, except if in the press, but she does. And I think she shows it, and that's just, that is just, I think, in her nature. Yes?
What kind of causes do you think Bill Clinton would take on his first husband?
I just think, it will certainly be foreign. I would think it would be foreign policy if it's not at the United Nations. I think his niche would be as a global representative of the White House. So that's kind of, and I think he would be very good at that. I think people who have seen him and observed him are a little concerned about his health nowadays and his what's the word Trump was using, his stamina. So come on, give me a break. Anyway, but I think he will be a presence. But I would think it'd be more on the world scene. One more question, if anybody has one, and I would like, I would like a hostile questions to remind you of South Carolina, I guess, a little bit. So.
What happens to Bill Clinton should Hillary lose the election? What happens to the two of them?
Boy, you know what? I think if Hillary loses, and I don't think it will be entirely fair, I think there will be a real bloodletting against both Clintons. I think there's going to be a hugely negative reaction because I think the assumption is going to be this was hers to lose. She loused it up. He didn't help her. And so I think there's going to be, you talk about a lot of stuff going on in the Republican Party. I think the Democratic Party will come in for a lot of, if she loses.
Any role left in the Democratic Party?
They, what, pardon?
Will they have any official role?
I would doubt it. I would doubt it. And I think one weakness of the Clintons, I believe, is that I would have to say the same for Obama, that they did not cultivate a new generation of leaders. They were so dominant in the Democratic Party that they didn't allow others to kind of, to develop. And I think the Democrats are very much hurting because of that. And so I think that's going to be, but the bloodletting is what I would describe if Hillary loses this election. I don't think you'll be hearing, I think they're not going to go into exile, but I don't think you're going to be hearing about it. Anyway, thank you very much for coming.